Hi everyone, my name is David Wineroither. I'm currently a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Social Sciences and the National University for Public Service in Budapest. I'm a former Worth Institute Doctoral Fellow and visiting professor in the University of Alberta. And it's therefore with special pleasure and special thanks to the Worth Institute and its wonderful crew to providing me with the opportunity to present parts of my current research project, Seeking for Shelter, which deals with the sectoral basis of economic voting in a selected number of post-industrial societies. This is certainly too much research to do to be carried out by one person only, which is why this is a collaborative project. I carry it out generously supported by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences with two dear distinguished colleagues, Florian Weiler from CU and Simon Fink from the University of Göttingen.
Specifically in our research we ask if and how market forces together with governmental action actually foster a polarization between workforce into two broadly defined groups, those entirely or partly sheltered from social risks and those entirely exposed to them without any constraint, without any interference by national government. And if, in a second step, this form of political agency clientelistic in nature because there is much more demand than supply for these types of political risk buffering, whether this leads to a substantially different vote choice among the clients, so the sheltered workforce of this behavior, and those who remain outsiders, which is the fully exposed workforce. What are the precise theoretical foundations for our argument, our prediction to see the unfolding of a rather new electoral divide along sectoral boundaries between those sheltered and those exposed to market forces by economic forces and political forces alike? We looked into the social policy preference formation literature that tries to explain the welfare state policy preferences among voters. And this is quite a prolific, wonderful literature, which carves out that there are essentially two dimensions of risk hedging that inform voters' preferences and probably also vote choice. One is job security, and the other one is income stability, also predicted, anticipated into the more or less foreseeable future, both at the individual level and the household level. So these are two key dimensions of risk hedging, social risk hedging, that the workforce is interested in to see, from which it would like to be relieved and enjoy buffering, or as it is our wording, shelteredness. Now, against conventional wisdom, national governments have quite effective tools, means to interfere in this process. There are some party types that are more or less specialized in providing this particular clientelistic service. So they can do that, they can perform that task effectively, but at the same time selectively, which means it's an interference which is clientelistic in nature because not the entire citizenry, not all the workforce of a country, not all voters in post-industrial societies are able to enjoy these forms of shelteredness for economic reasons. This is a costly thing to do that harms national economic development and prosperity. And at the same time, it's costly politically. Why is the latter the case? The literature on electoral behavior shows, on the one hand, that larger mainstream parties, conventional parties, in brackets I add of the past, they managed to hold on to these rather secure pockets of voters that they service clientelistically. Many of them would identify as party identifiers. So this is core and stable constituency of these parties. But there are other party types, movement type parties, younger, fresher ones, opposition parties that challenge this particular link, that criticize it. Right-wing populist parties, leftist libertarian parties, many liberal parties, centrist parties. And they are quite effective in making this a salient issue at the polls, because clientelism here in the form of shelteredness provided to parts of the citizenry is actually violating core principles of universal access and equal representation that are very closely attached to the value of democracy itself. So these different strands of theory make us being optimistic to see the effect in our empirical study that we want to find, that we expect to find. But of course, this is an open process, open to falsification. So we actually start with a case study design, a most likely case, the Austrian polity, where conditions for the electoral divide in the described fashion to emerge over time are the best. So if here in this case of Austria, the Austrian polity, we don't find anything substantial and reliable in our data, then actually it would make little sense to pursue the project. But we are confident, and our first results seem to indicate that we are on the right track here. We indeed find our hypothesis confirmed. So why is Austria a most likely case? Economically speaking, there are three reasons. First, it's a small economy with high trade openness. In the past, Austrian governments, grand coalitions of Social Democrats and Christian Democrats invested a lot in sheltering policy against the ups and downs of international market developments. They decided already quite a while ago that this is not something sustainable. It's an affluent country that continues to invest in wage restraint. Austrian social partnership has always been quite effective and dedicated to wage restraint in order to keep industries, larger ones, smaller ones, in Austria competitive against world markets. So altogether, there is an above average risk exposure, also thanks to the setup of the continental type welfare state in Austria and the high trade openness and other factors that have to do with specification of education, on the vocational training, on the job training. So all this promotes that there is a lot at stake looking into the market forces and economic dynamics. Then, as of the moral component to it, so what is the public thinking about shelterness granted to some, but not to many, and certainly not to the majority? Well, there is high visibility through political scandals. Think of patronage here, regulations, subsidies. This is not outright corrupt behavior, but it's smelly, it's fishy, and it's something the public takes notice of. And important is the link of these practices to the political forces, the party political actors that are responsible for it, that are running this very special business. So the public in Austria, because we talk about long-standing clientelistic ties, about high rates of party identifiers, of many decades of almost uninterrupted grand coalition governing, governments composed of the two party machines, Social Democrats and Christian Democrats or Christian conservatives, there is in general, and certainly compared with other countries, there's quite high accuracy in the knowledge of the general public about this agent-client relationship. So who is providing the spoils and who is on the receiving end, and who are the outsiders and what are the costs. On the supply side, well, we should also mention that Austria, when it comes to clientelism, is a notorious case. Long established, comprehensive behavior, on retreat, but still notorious. And we have one more ingredient to turn this into a very salient topic at the polls, which is the presence of challenger parties that target cross-pressured constituencies of clientelistic parties. Think of social democratic voters that are outsiders, that are exposed to market forces, that might have other policy-related reasons to stay with their party, that maybe have an emotional bond they feel with the Social Democratic Party of Austria, but that also feel, and that's a sentiment important for social democratic voters in Western European countries, that clientelism in fact violates universal principles of democratic rule, something they hold up and which they find violated by their own party familial home. I mentioned before that clientelism is something that has always been going on also in democracy, not only developing countries, but also the group of advanced capitalist countries that are affluent, pretty wealthy countries, at least on average, where for a number of reasons this is a rather counterintuitive finding. The ideal would be, and also the theoretical expectation, according to developmental theory, that here the party competition is primarily, if not solely, about programmatic offers, about policy solutions presented to the public. What we do see is that clientelism, if plotted against the GDP per capita, is declining, at least for advanced capitalist countries. So above a certain threshold of economic development, it's becoming more unlikely and less sustainable to be engaged in clientelism, at least for the majority of parties. But if then we looked into the peer group of advanced capitalist countries, including Austria and consisting of OECD countries, we find Austria actually above average, which indicates that at this level of economic development, Austria is a notorious case when it comes to political clientelism. Austria, or more specifically Social Democrats and Christian Democrats, preserved notorious levels of clientelism when compared to her peer group of other affluent post-industrial democracies of Western style, despite selective retreat, like we also saw it happening in a number of other countries, over the past 10, 15, perhaps rather 20 years. We see Austria encircled, and everything below the line in this plot would actually indicate a scaling back on clientelistic solutions provided by certain governmental parties, party machines that more or less effectively run this business. So this, as we are all humans, steers up feelings of deservingness and undeservingness, because there is much more demand for shelteredness than political parties, even the most and heavily clientelistic ones, are able and, perhaps even more important, willing to provide. In our study, we employ a difference in difference quasi-experimental design, which has to be combined with propensity score matching. If you're familiar with regression analysis, these propensity score matching, more or less, I simplify, equals working with controls in order to isolate the key effect and substantiate the direction and magnitude of an effect, net of other factors that might be influencing in a confounding way the same results that we want to analyze. This comes with various reliability checks and extensive internal and external validation. The literature is very, very complex on this matter, but we're optimistic that we finally gonna meet all the challenges that come with it. Our main data source is the European Social Survey, all rounds from 1 to 9. This stretches over almost a 20 years period. We cannot rely on ESS round number 6 because, for reasons that are unknown to us, Austria was not participating in this fieldwork, in this wave of evaluation. What are, as of the European Social Survey, what are the key variables for determining sectoral background? I have selected a few that might indicate to you or show you some of the struggles that we have and where we want it to come. First of all, we needed a variable that captures the party voted for in the last election of a respondent. This has to be weighted because we met also in the ESS dataset, we met under reporting on behalf of right-wing populist voters and over-reporting, overstating in the case of leftist libertarian parties, green parties. We were interested, of course, in the precise employment relation in conjunction with the design of the contract. Very important it was for us to know whether a respondent has a limited or unlimited contract. All this, of course, embedded in knowledge of the national legislation on labor markets, on hiring and firing, on social entitlements, on pension entitlements, etc. So that's a long list of questions that all poured into the final allocation of a case, of a respondent, of a member of the workforce into one of 3 categories: sheltered, partly sheltered, and exposed. There's one variable also very, very helpful to us, or theoretically helpful to us. What type of organization a respondent works for or worked for in case of someone that already retired. This we needed to be sure whether a respondent is in public service, as a public servant status, or is in private business, is a blue collar worker or a white collar worker. And we had to work hard on external validation there because this particular very helpful variable enters the European Social Survey only with round 3. So we had to work around it and establish external validity for a different strategy of matching for the first 2 rounds. And then finally, we needed very precise information of the type of job, type of occupation somebody is working in. And for that, we could rely on the ISCO coding scheme of the International Labour Organization, which is featured in the ESS. So we are looking here into a classification that features several hundreds of occupations. And we could actually, with our established criteria, some of them I mentioned just a moment ago to you, we could actually screen respondents and with this matrix of evaluation, and then finally come up with a customized choice of allocation at the sectoral level. A lot of this information that we need for a proper sectoral allocation of an individual is actually national specific. So for that reason, we also are currently looking into all sorts of legal documents, academic working papers, comparative international indices. There is a very elaborate offshoreability ranking that we also factor in, and a number of other customized data, longitudinal data, survey data that we all bring together in authoritatively making a judgment on a respondent's sectoral background. Now, let me feature one example where economic forces and an offshoreability ranking would actually contradict themselves, and still, in terms of sectoral background and party choice and political preference formation, would still not tell the entire story. So think of someone who is a farmer, who is not employed in farming, who is not an agricultural specialist, but who runs his own farm, who is an entrepreneur in that respect. Now here we have, in some regard, a very low offshoreability rate, because this is business that has a certain location, it's bound to geography. It's not like in computer businesses, services, not something that can be easily or entirely outsourced to, well, India, to give just one example, or a number of other countries around the globe. But at the same time, they suffer from a high market exposure and pressure, which is, fortunately, in the Austrian case for farmers, that is partly lifted and curtailed by legislative action. So you see low offshoreability, still a very high market exposure, high income volatility, and even job insecurity because of volatility of markets. And you have political action that, to some degree, but I would say in the Austrian context to significant degree, overrides and limits this exposure. There are certain income taxation privileges, a fuel privilege. There are transfer payments that are coming from different levels of administration and government, regional, national, but also some are granted at the European level. So altogether, these transfer payments amount to 30%, roughly 30% of farming income in Austria right now. And in reverse, not entirely surprising, they represent a stable, maybe the most stable key constituency for a mainstream political party, the Conservatives, that are in possession of a very strong, pivotal intra-party stakeholder position, which so this is one of the linkages that are known and visible to the public, where there was no scaling back, no retreat from over the past 20-30 years. In a number of cases, we ran into specific pitfalls. There's too little time to be really elaborate on it. One question is whether we should actually operate at the individual level, or we shift to the household income level. ESS features one variable that refers to household income and the primary source of the household income, because at the household income we might see cross pressures. Two partners might actually have a different sectoral background, or that's not an unlikely scenario. We had to work hard, as I said before, on establishing the civil servant status. So we cross-checked ESS data contained in various variables with the NACE and CLEMS European data sets that work at the industrial level to cross-check. And it seems that for the first two ESS rounds, we could correctly attribute civil servant status or the absence thereof for at least 90 to 92% of respondents. Migrant background is potentially something we should check for with a dummy variable, because one of the factors to see the unfolding of our electoral divide is political knowledge and interest of the clientelistic relationship and who is the principal and who is the agent. And finally, we should also deal with time variance, as many of the driving factors, market forces and political interference and or the legal body that there is of mediating influence on vote choice is not something completely stable, but it changes over time. In the Austrian context, something we took a look at was, for instance, the implications of the large pension reform of the conservative right-wing populist government introduced in 2003 that probably cost them re-election in the 2006 general election. Now let me very briefly report to even more preliminary first results on the sectoral vote differential for the mainstream party machines, Social Democrats and Christian Democrats, for roughly 20 years of parliamentary elections in Austria. We ran very simple models. They are not yet entirely customized and specified, and we are not entirely through with the propensity score matching, but with a very big but still let me report that the first findings are very promising. We see the accumulative unfolding of the expected loyalty gap, which means that among sheltered voters, the two party machines, centrist party machines, they are holding up. They are already high support over roughly 20 years period from a very high level as a reference point, which is here depicted as ESS 2002. Behind that is actually the 1999 general election. That's the base from which we are measuring in our difference in difference experimental design the change in party choice and party support among sheltered voters and exposed ones. And while among sheltered voters, the two parties actually managed, somewhat stunningly, managed to further increase their support by 2-3 percentage points, they incurred drastic losses about the partly sheltered and exposed ones. And what you can see in this trend line is the vote differential. So in 2000, so it actually peaked at minus 19%, which means 19% among exposed and partly sheltered voters. The two parties lost in that particular year, that's the election year of 2013, they compared with 1999 had lost 22%, while they were up by 3% among sheltered voters. So the net difference was 19. I encircled two points, two elections. The first one hints at the 2002 general election, and the other one, the freshest one, is referring to the 2017 general election. So these are the two elections that actually run contrary to the rule of accumulative effects in the predicted direction. And these were two outlier elections because in these two elections we saw a massive electoral rebound in favor of the conservatives. So one of the two party machines. they, in both elections, managed to pull over a massive amount of former right-wing populist voters. And this is probably, but we will run additional regression analysis on that matter, probably explaining why here we see a short-term reversal of the trend. Seeking for Shelter is a research project generously funded by the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. So there's a bit more to come. Preliminary results indicate that we are still in the beginning of our research, which will expand over 1.5 to 2 years. We also will be able to hire additional pre-doc and doctoral support for various tasks. But there are a few things of which we already know that we would like to perform them. One is to run, of course, additional difference in difference design models and regression analysis. We will check if the results actually change once we switched from the individual level to the household level. We will also want to come up with additional models that capture, that include all those currently not being active workforce, for being full-time students, for instance, or that are housewives, or that are for other reasons not employed and also not motivated currently to become again or for the first time a member of active workforce. And this includes the very large group, of course, of former active workforce, which is pensioners. We will certainly expand geographically once that we see the favorable results for Austria as a most likely case confirmed. In a more in-depth analysis, we're gonna expand and incorporate a least likely case, which we will probably find in Scandinavia. Denmark is a candidate, also Finland, for mostly two reasons. One is that we have a much higher degree of programmatic policy-based structuration of party competition in these countries. And the second would be that governmental composition is much more fluid than in the case of Austria. And in between, we will operate with a third case, an intermediate case, where favorable and unfavorable conditions are both present at the same time, and more or less in imbalance, which is Germany. Now, in looking into the a little more far future, we consider to form a multi-country consortium, incorporate Northern American cases, Canada, the US, of course, and probably or perhaps translate this into a book project. One question that we yet have to decide is whether it makes, for analytical reasons, sense to incorporate younger democracies, Central Eastern European ones. We are brainstorming and for the moment stick to, the implications of some first findings. What are the key, vague as they are, implications of our first tiny findings? Well, first of all, we could discuss whether we have a divide here, or it's a fully fledged cleavage structure. So something that is deeply engraved in society, which is informing vote choice over multiple rounds of elections, and which is something that cannot easily be changed or turned into something less important, less salient for many voters by governmental action in the short or medium run. So a divide is something else than a cleavage, and a cleavage is, in heuristic terms, something more demanding. We also contribute to explaining the right-wing populist party vote, in particular the defection of blue-collar workers towards right-wing populist parties, which in Austria but also elsewhere seems to be a realignment, not a one-term thing, not something which comes as a pendulum swing, but many blue-collar workers, relative and absolute majorities, found a new political home over the course of the last 20 years. Sectoral voting and resistance to it partly explains this phenomenon, and it would strengthen the argument that it's still economics stupid or socioeconomics, because this is what is behind shelteredness and sectoral voting, as opposed to voting on issues of cultural identity. The latter is actually the more standard answer to in explaining the defection of blue-collar workers towards the right-wing populist vote, while we more or less directly insist on the economic considerations in it. Well, an open question is whether this development that we can see for the Social Democrats and Christian Democrats, but more so consistently for the Social Democrats, actually results in a new genuine type of political party, which is a mainstream party actually acting as a shelter party, which faces difficulty in addressing voters that are not part of the sheltered universe with their universalistic values that have always been at the core of socialism and social democratic policy platforms. So they might also in the future hurt their electoral prospects by the strings put around their neck in the past. Now, the question is whether conservatives, or this actually increases the odds for one of the two clientelistic parties in a scenario where we have actually two of them competing with each other and both of them having a long tradition of clientelistic agency and servicing, whether this increases the electoral stakes for one of them to break out. And this is something that an image which got conveyed by the recent transformation of the People's Party under the leadership of Sebastian Kurz. It played out very well at the polls in 2017 for them, and also even more recently in 2019. I would say that this is more about having selling points and packaging and wrapping up things, and change was actually limited and not transformative at all. But strategically speaking, they could distance themselves from the notion of being a clientelistic party, at least to some degree, and it helped them substantially at the polls, and it hurt their second mainstream clientelistic competitor badly.
Thank you very much for your attention. I hope you liked what you heard and that this presentation, this research project steered some interest in issues of comparative politics, of voting behavior, of representation. Whatever your feedback looks like, input is always most welcome. So please get in touch with me if you feel like. I'm certainly looking forward to any interaction with you. Thank you and goodbye.